The stagecoach wheel struck a rut, sending a jarring shock through the thin floorboards. Liddy Grace, 18 years old, was thrown hard against the cracked leather brace, her teeth clicking together. She said nothing, only pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and pressed her face against the cold glass. Wyoming stretched out before her, a flat, endless brown under a sky too large and too gray. It looked like a land that had already died. In her lap, her hands, chapped and raw, white-knuckled the letter. It was the only thing she owned that mattered. The paper was worn soft at the creases, the ink blurred by the desperate humidity of her palms. It was a letter of agreement, a promise of marriage to a man named Eli Monroe, a stranger who owned a ranch at the edge of the world. It was her only escape. The jolting of the coach brought back other, worse sensations. The heavy weight of a hand on her shoulder, the smell of whiskey and stale tobacco, masked by the righteous scent of pipe smoke. Her stepfather's voice, a low rumble that promised salvation while it delivered damnation. Her mother had been dead 4 years, taken by a fever that left her skin gray and her breath shallow. Liddy had been left alone with the preacher. At first, the punishments were for small things, a poorly swept floor, a moment of idle staring out the window. He called it sparing the rod. But the punishments changed as she grew. They moved from the parlor to her bedroom. They happened later at night. They became intimate. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the memories back. The coach smelled of dust and old sweat, but she could only smell the lye soap he used to wash his hands, the hands that explored and judged and punished. The agreement with Mr. Monroe had been her stepfather's idea of mercy. It came just after the doctor's visit. The preacher had dragged her to the old man, complaining of her melancholy and barrenness. The doctor, a man with watery eyes and rough hands, had examined her. It was not an examination. It was a violation, cold and clinical, that left her feeling hollowed out, a thing made of wood. His verdict was whispered to the preacher, but Liddy heard it. "She is damaged, preacher, scarring, deep. It is unlikely she will ever carry a child." The preacher had almost smiled. It was a look of confirmation. He had always told her she was unclean, a vessel of sin. Now, the town doctor had proven it. It gave him the justification he needed. He could not have a barren and damaged woman under his roof. It was a poor reflection on his ministry. So he found a man in a territory hundreds of miles away, a man desperate enough for a wife that he would take one sight unseen, paying only for her passage. Liddy looked back down at the letter. Eli Monroe. He had agreed. He was waiting. She was not traveling toward a marriage. She was fleeing a haunting miles away, in that same biting gray wind. Eli Monroe drove the last nail into a loose shutter. He was 32, but the wind and the grief had carved deeper lines into his face than his years accounted for. He paused, rubbing the heel of his hand against his chest, feeling the small, hard circle of metal beneath his woolen shirt. He pulled the leather thong over his head. The ring, a simple gold band, rested in his calloused palm. Sarah's ring. He had worn it every day for the 2 years since he had buried her and their son, who had never taken a breath, in the frozen ground behind the cabin. He shoved the ring back under his shirt, the cold metal a familiar sting against his skin. He was not looking for love. He was not looking for a replacement. He was looking for a pair of hands. He was looking for the sound of another human being in the crushing silence of the high plains. His ranch was not a place of comfort. It was a place of survival. The cabin was small, sturdy, but the barn roof leaked, a constant dripping problem he never seemed to get ahead of. The land was hemmed in by jagged gray cliffs that tore at the clouds. The wind never stopped. It was a high, thin scream that promised winter and isolation. His life was hardtack and beans, mending fences in the snow, and waking up alone. He had sent the letter 3 months ago, Answering an advertisement in an Eastern paper. A widower, he wrote, seeking a respectable woman for companionship and to share the burdens of the ranch. He had enclosed enough money for the ticket. He expected someone sturdy, perhaps a widow herself, someone who understood that life out here was work, not romance. He looked toward the pass, squinting against the wind. The stage was late. He felt a dull ache of impatience. Nothing more. He just wanted the arrival to be over, so the work could begin. The stagecoach finally rattled into the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town. It was little more than a general store, a saloon, and a pastor's house. Eli was waiting by the hitching post. Liddy was the last one out. The driver had to help her down. Eli's first thought was, "She's a child." She was pale, her skin almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. She was thin, the wind whipping her threadbare dress around her legs. She clutched a single, worn carpet bag, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were wide, terrified, like a rabbit caught in a snare. This was not the sturdy widow he had pictured. This was a ghost. "Mr. Monroe?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Ma'am," he nodded, touching the brim of his hat. He took her bag. It weighed almost nothing. "The pastor is waiting." There was no conversation on the short walk. The marriage was done quickly. The words spoken in Pastor Allen's cold parlor. The pastor's wife watching with a look of severe judgment. Liddy stared at the floor the entire time. Her "I will" so quiet the pastor had to ask her to repeat it. Eli led her to his wagon. The ride to the ranch was 2 hours. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the creak of the wagon wheels. Liddy did not look at him. She just stared out at the cliffs, as if measuring them for an escape. When they arrived at the cabin, the sun was a bleeding red smear in the west. The cabin was one room, a fireplace, a table, and a bed. The bed was the loudest thing in the room. Liddy saw it and took a half-step back, her hand flying to her throat. Eli saw the panic. He was tired, his bones aching from the cold, but he was not a cruel man. He dropped her bag by the door and turned to stir the fire, giving her his back. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough, "but it's warm." She said nothing. He busied himself making coffee, the familiar motions a comfort. He poured a cup and set it on the table, then poured one for himself, leaning against the rough-hewn mantel. He watched her. She had not moved. She was standing by the door, a small, dark shape against the dying light. "You can have the bed," he said. She flinched, a small, violent tremor. "No, I can sleep by the fire." "The floor is cold and hard." "I don't mind." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This was not what he had planned. He had planned for simple companionship. He had not planned for this raw, visible fear. "We're married, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low. "But I ain't a man to force a thing." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for the lie. She found none, only weariness. She finally moved, picking up her bag and taking it to the darkest corner of the cabin, between the wall and a tall, unsteady cupboard. She sat on the floor and pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her shawl around her. Eli watched her curl up like a stray dog expecting a kick. He drank his coffee. It tasted like ash. He tossed the dregs into the fire. He took the thinnest of the blankets from the bed and walked over to her. He did not touch her. He just dropped it beside her. "The nights are cold," he said. Then he took his coat, walked back to the fireplace, and sat on the hard stone hearth, leaning his head against the wall. Sleep did not come easily to either of them. The cabin was filled with the sound of the wind and the pop of the fire. But hours later, when the fire was burning low, Eli was jolted awake by a sound, a whimper. He sat up, his senses sharp. Liddy was thrashing in the corner, her body rigid in the moonlight that streamed through the window. She was trapped in a dream. "No," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep and terror. "Please, it's not right, don't." Eli stood slowly, unsure. Perhaps it was just the journey. Then she cried out, her voice clear and sharp in the cold room. "Don't touch me down there, please, no, I'll be good." Eli froze. The words hung in the air, terrible and plain. He felt a cold sickness rise in his throat. He understood. In that moment, what kind of haunted look she wore? It was not the journey. It was the place she had left. He turned, his movements quiet. He put another log on the fire. Not for himself, but for her. He grabbed his heavier coat from the peg, opened the cabin door, and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind hit him, sharp as glass. He walked to the barn, the leaky roof a dark shadow against the cliffs. He sat in the hay, the smell of dust and animals around him, and pulled the ring from under his shirt, holding it in his hand until the metal was warm. He did not go back inside until the sun was up. The days that followed fell into a harsh, silent routine. Eli rose before dawn, started the fire, and left coffee on the stove. By the time Liddy woke, he was already gone, his axe ringing against wood in the distance, or his figure a small dot on the ridge, mending the fence line. He worked until his muscles burned and his hands were raw. He worked to stay away from the cabin, to stay away from the fear in her eyes. He did not know how to approach her. He knew how to break a horse, how to read the sky, how to set a splint. He did not know how to fix what was broken in her. He spoke gently when he had to, telling her where the flour was kept, or how to bolt the door, but he kept his distance. Liddy tried. She tried to be the wife he had paid for. She swept the floor, though her hands shook. She tried to cook. She had never been taught. Her mother was dead, and the preacher had not allowed her near the kitchen, calling it worldly distraction. She tried to make bread. The dough was a sticky, lifeless lump. The loaves she pulled from the hearth oven were hard as stones. One evening, Eli came in, exhausted and covered in snow from an early squall. The cabin was thick with smoke. A pot of stew was scorched black on the bottom, the meat tough, the broth bitter. Liddy was standing by the table, tears streaming down her face, her hands red from trying to scrub the pot. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I ruined it. I'm sorry." Eli looked at the pot. He looked at her, small and weeping in the smoky room. He said nothing. He walked to the basin, washed the grime from his face and hands, and then sat at the table. He ladled the burned stew into a bowl. He picked up a piece of the rock-hard bread. He ate. He chewed the blackened meat. He dipped the bread in the bitter broth. He ate every last bit of it. The silence in the cabin broken only by the sound of his spoon against the bowl and her quiet, desperate sobbing. When he was finished, he put the bowl in the basin. He looked at her, still crying by the wall. "We need more supplies," he said, his voice flat. She nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. He looked out the window. The sky was low and the color of lead. The wind had picked up, driving pellets of ice against the glass. "A blizzard's coming," he said. "A bad one. We're low on flour and salt." He grabbed his heavy coat again. Liddy watched him, her eyes wide. "Get your shawl," he said, pulling his hat low. "We ride for town, now." Eli saddled his own horse, a tall roan, and the quieter mare for Liddy. The mare was old and steady, but Liddy approached it like it was a wolf. She stood by its head, her hands clenched in the thin fabric of her dress. "She won't bite," Eli said, his voice clipped by the cold. He held the reins out to her. Liddy flinched but took them. Her hands were blue. She wore only the thin shawl she had arrived in. Eli looked at her, then at the gray, churning sky. The wind was a physical thing, pushing against them, promising ice. He unfastened the top buttons of his heavy canvas coat, the one lined with sheepskin. He shrugged it off. For a moment, he stood in just his woolen shirt, the wind cutting straight through him. He did not seem to notice. He held the coat out. "Put this on." Liddy stared at it. It was huge, heavy, and smelled of him, of pine smoke, leather, and horse. "I can't. You'll freeze." "I've been colder. Put it on, or we don't go." His voice was not kind, but it was not cruel. It was final. She hesitated, then slipped her arms into the sleeves. The coat swallowed her. It hung to her knees, the cuffs covering her hands completely, but a wave of warmth, his warmth, enveloped her. She looked down, hiding her face in the tall collar. "Thank you," she whispered, so low he almost missed it. He grunted, giving her a leg up onto the mare. She rode stiffly, her back a straight, rigid line, as if expecting a blow from the wind itself. Eli rode ahead, breaking the trail, his shoulders set against the coming storm. The ride was brutal. The wind howled down from the cliffs, carrying needles of sleet that stung any exposed skin. Liddy huddled inside the coat, her world reduced to the smell of the wool and the sight of Eli's broad back moving steadily through the gray landscape. He never looked back, not once, but he kept the pace slow for her. When they reached the settlement, it looked deserted. Smoke plumed from the chimneys of the saloon and the general store, but the street was empty. Eli hitched the horses to the post in front of Henderson's General Mercantile. The bell above the door jangled a cheerless welcome as they entered. The store was warmer, smelling of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and oiled wood. Mr. Henderson, a small man with a stained apron and spectacles, was measuring out beans for a woman bundled in furs. It was Pastor Allen's wife. When the pastor's wife saw them, her face tightened. She looked at Liddy, her gaze traveling from the girl's haunted eyes down to the oversized man's coat she wore, and a look of profound distaste settled on her features. She turned her back on them pointedly, paying Mr. Henderson in sharp, clipped tones. Liddy felt the scrutiny like a physical touch. She shrank, moving to stand behind Eli, trying to disappear into the folds of the coat. "She won't last the winter," the pastor's wife said to Henderson, her voice a low, carrying whisper. "Look at her, frail and touched, if you ask me." "It's a shame," Henderson whispered back, not looking at them. "Monroe lost a good woman. To replace her with that." Liddy's breath caught. She could feel the blood drain from her face. The pastor's wife finished her transaction and swept past them, pulling her furs tight, refusing to meet Eli's gaze. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving a cold silence. Eli stepped up to the counter. He pulled a list from his shirt pocket. "Mr. Henderson, I need flour, 50 pounds, and salt, coffee, and 10 pounds of bacon." Henderson busied himself under the counter, not looking up. "I'm afraid I'm short on flour. Monroe, saving it for my regular customers." Eli's voice was flat. "I am a regular customer. I've been trading here for 5 years." "Times are hard," Henderson said, finally looking up. His eyes slid past Eli to Liddy, who was trying to hide behind a barrel of nails. He sneered, a small, ugly twisting of his lips. "And my customers? Well, they're particular about the company I keep. Can't be seen trading with just anyone." Eli went very still. The air in the store grew thick and cold. "What are you saying, Henderson?" "I'm saying," the shopkeeper said, gaining courage from Eli's quiet, "that I run a decent establishment. I don't cater to damaged goods, or the men who buy them." He looked directly at Liddy. "Heard she was barren, spoiled, sent west 'cause no decent man would have her." Liddy made a small, choked sound, like a stepped-on bird. Eli moved faster than Henderson could track. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He simply reached across the counter, grabbed the front of Henderson's apron and his shirt, and hauled the smaller man halfway over the polished wood. Sacks of beans toppled to the floor. "You will," Eli said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Fill my order, and you will never speak of my wife again." Henderson's face went white, his spectacles askew. He clawed at Eli's wrist. "Monroe, let go! This is ungodly!" "God ain't in this room," Eli breathed, his face inches from the shopkeeper's. "But I am. Fill the order." He shoved Henderson back. The man stumbled, crashing into the shelves behind him. But Liddy was already gone. The bell had jangled. Eli turned to see the door swinging shut, the gray, swirling snow visible in the street beyond. He cursed, a sharp, violent word. He turned back to the terrified shopkeeper. "The flour, now!" He found her huddled between the horses, her face buried in the mare's flank, her shoulders shaking. She was not making a sound, just trembling violently in the coat. Eli finished loading the sacks onto the roan, his movements stiff with anger. He had defended his name, his choice, but he had exposed her. He had brought her here only to be wounded again. He grabbed the mare's bridle. "We're leaving." She did not look at him. She let him help her into the saddle, her body limp. The ride back was worse. The sleet had turned to a thick, driving snow. The wind was a solid wall. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness was falling, and the world had been erased, leaving only the screaming white of the storm. He got her inside, unsaddled the horses, and hauled the supplies into the cabin, slamming the door against the blizzard. The sound was final. They were locked in. Liddy had not moved from the bench by the door. She was still wearing his coat, staring at her hands. "You're shaking," Eli said. "Get near the fire." She obeyed, moving like a sleepwalker. She sat on the floor, on the same spot she had claimed that first night, and stared into the flames. Eli made coffee, his movements economical. He did not speak. The cabin was filled with the roar of the wind, a sound like a freight train passing just outside the walls. The snow hissed against the windows. Days would pass before this ended. He handed her a cup. Their fingers brushed. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was raw. "For what? You did nothing." "For what he said, that I'm spoiled. It's true. I am. You bought a broken thing." Eli crouched by the fire, the heat hitting his face. He felt the anger from the store, cold and hard, still settled in his gut. "He's a fool. He knows nothing." "He knows enough," she said. "The preacher, my stepfather, he wrote to Pastor Allen. He told him I was a trial, that I was barren and willful, that I was lucky to be given away." She pulled her knees to her chest, her small face illuminated by the fire. "He was a man of God. Everyone believed him. No one believed me." Eli looked at her, truly looked at her, the haunted child. "What did he do to you?" Liddy was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The storm raged. "My mother, she was beautiful. She was always singing. When she died, the singing stopped. The house got quiet. And he started to notice me. He said I had my mother's eyes, but my father's sinful nature. He said it was his duty to purify me." She was speaking to the fire, not to him. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if telling a story that had happened to someone else. "The punishments, they were for my soul. He said he used a birch rod, then his belt, then his hands. He said he had to root out the sin. He took me to the doctor, the one who said I was damaged. After that, the preacher said no man would have me, that I was only fit to serve. She choked on the word. He said I owed him for my keep." She stopped. She did not need to say the rest. The silence in the room was heavier and more terrible than the storm. Eli stared into the fire. The chain around his neck felt heavy. He thought of Henderson's sneer, of the pastor's wife's judgment. He thought of the words he had heard her cry in her sleep. "Don't touch me down there." He fed another log into the flames. My wife, he said, his voice rough. Liddy looked up, startled. He never spoke of her. Her name was Sarah, he said, his eyes on the fire. We were married 4 years. This land. It was hard on her. She was from the East, used to green fields and neighbors. But she was strong, stronger than me, in most ways. He touched the ring through his shirt. She wanted a child. More than anything, when she finally quickened, it was the first time I'd seen her truly happy out here. The labor came early, in a storm just like this one. He swallowed, the memory thick in his throat. I couldn't get the doctor. The snow was too deep. I did what I could. I'd helped birth calves, foals, I thought, but it was wrong. It all went wrong. She bled for hours. She died just before dawn. The boy, he never took a breath. I buried them both on the hill, under the same cross. He looked at his hands. They were large, calloused, scarred from work and weather. I held my son. He was perfect, small, but cold. I held him, and I hated him. I hated him because he took her. He closed his eyes. And I hate myself for it, every day. He opened his eyes. Liddy was watching him. Her own tears had dried, leaving salty tracks on her pale cheeks. She was not looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with a deep, aching understanding. He told me I was unclean, she whispered. He said I was a vessel of sin. He lied, Eli said, his voice quiet but fierce. He was the sin, not you. They sat in silence for a long time, the blizzard sealing them in, the fire a small, warm island in a world of cold. The days blurred, the snow piled high against the windows, blotting out the world, turning the cabin into a dim, quiet cave. The wind never stopped. They survived. A new understanding, fragile and unspoken, settled between them. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. Eli taught her things. He showed her how to bank the fire so it would last the night. He brought in the milking goat, its nervous bleating a strange comfort, and showed her how to milk it. His large hands guiding hers, his touch impersonal, respectful. She did not flinch. He brought the heavy tack into the cabin, the leather stiff and cold. The stitching is rotten, he said, dumping it on the floor. It needs to be repaired, or the saddles will fail. He showed her how to use the awl and the waxed thread. Her fingers were small, but nimble. She sat for hours by the fire, her head bent, stitching the leather with neat, precise movements. He watched her sometimes, the way the firelight caught the faint red in her brown hair. He watched her mend what was broken. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on an oilcloth. He had a deep, jagged scar across the back of his right hand, a white line from his thumb to his knuckle. Liddy finished a strap and set it aside. She looked at his hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What?" "The scar." "No," he said. "Not anymore. A branding iron. I was young, stupid." She reached out, her fingers barely grazing the raised skin. It was the first time she had touched him on purpose. Her fingertip was cool. The touch was light as a moth's wing, but it burned him. It lingered. He stopped cleaning the rifle. She pulled her hand back, her face flushing, as if she had done something wrong. The tension in the cabin shifted. It was no longer just two people surviving a storm. It was a man and a woman. The bed, which he had not slept in since she arrived, suddenly seemed very large. That night, the storm broke, the wind died, and a heavy, oppressive silence fell. The moon came out, bathing the snow-covered world in a bright, silver light. Liddy had made a stew. It was not burned. The bread was heavy, but it was edible. They ate at the table, together. Afterward, Eli did not move to the hearth. Liddy did not move to her corner. They sat at the table. "Liddy," he said. Her name felt strange on his tongue. She looked up, her eyes wide. We are man and wife, by law. He said it simply, a fact. She nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. I know. I am not your stepfather. I know, she whispered. He stood up. He walked to the bed and pulled back the heavy quilt. He did not look at her. He looked at the pillow. I've been sleeping on the floor for weeks. I'm tired, and I'm cold. She understood. He was asking. He was not demanding. She stood slowly. She walked to the bed, her legs trembling. She did not take off her dress. She just slipped under the quilt, pulling it up to her chin, and lay on the very edge of the mattress, her back to him, her body rigid. Eli blew out the lamp. The room was lit only by the bright moonlight on the snow outside. He took off his boots and his heavy shirt. He lay down on the other side of the bed, on top of the quilt. He kept his back to her. He could feel the small, trembling heat of her through the layers of wool. He lay awake for hours, listening to her breathe. He did not know when he finally slept. He woke to her hand on his chest. It was tentative, her fingers light against his undershirt. He turned slowly. She was watching him, her face pale in the moonlight. She was afraid, but she was not running. Eli, she whispered. He said nothing. He just looked at her. She moved closer. She was crying, silent tears tracing paths down her temples. I want... She started, then stopped. I want to be a wife. I don't want to be afraid anymore. He moved his hand, covering hers where it lay on his chest. His hand was warm. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. A simple, gentle gesture. He leaned in. He kissed her forehead. It was clumsy. A husband's kiss, not a lover's. It tasted of salt. He moved slowly, testing. He kissed her cheek, her jaw. She was trembling, but she did not pull away. He kissed her mouth. It was a soft, closed-mouth press. Her lips were chapped and cold. He pulled back the quilt and moved to cover her, his weight resting on his elbows. He was heavy, solid, and warm. He smelled of smoke and the cold night air. He was nothing like the preacher. He kissed her again, deeper this time. She responded, a small, hesitant opening. It was not desire. It was a question. He moved his hand, his rough palm cupping her cheek. He kissed her throat. She arched, a small, involuntary movement. He moved his hand down, over the worn fabric of her dress, to her waist. He paused, waiting. She did not move. He slid his hand lower, over the curve of her hip. He touched her, gently, over the dress. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, a sound of sudden, bright pain. She shoved at his shoulders. No, please, it hurts. He recoiled instantly, rolling off her, putting space between them. Liddy, what? I didn't... She was curling into herself, her face screwed up in agony, her hands flying to cover herself. No, it hurts, she sobbed. I didn't hurt you, he said, his voice rough with confusion. I barely touched you. It hurts, she cried, her voice muffled by the pillow. It always hurts. It hurts down there. She paused, her sobbing catching in her throat. It hurts down there, too. Eli went still. Too? He lit the lamp. The sudden yellow light was harsh. She was huddled on the edge of the bed, her dress rucked up to her knees, her body drawn into a tight ball of misery. Liddy, he said, his voice low. Let me see. No, she screamed, a raw, animal sound. Don't look at me. I'm ruined. I am your husband, he said, and there was an iron in his voice she had not heard before. It was not anger. It was authority. I am not him. Let me see the hurt. She shook her head, weeping. He did not force her. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, and waited. He waited until her sobs quieted into small, hitching gasps. He said, she finally whispered to his back, that I was wrong inside. that the doctor said so. Eli turned. He moved slowly. He knelt on the floor beside the bed, so he was looking up at her. "Show me." Her hands were white, clenched in the fabric of her dress. She was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. But she looked at his face. She saw no lust. She saw no anger. She saw only a deep, profound stillness. Slowly, her hands trembling, she pulled the rough wool of her dress up. She kept her shift down, but raised it just enough. Eli looked. He had seen wounds. He had seen men gored by bulls, torn by wolves. He had seen the ruin of his wife's body. He had never seen this. It was not the body of an 18-year-old girl. It was the body of a victim. The skin of her inner thighs was a map of old, silvery white lines, and higher, where she was most vulnerable, there was not softness, there was damage, a terrible, puckered landscape of scarring, tissue that had been torn and had healed badly, tightly, wrongly. Eli Monroe froze. The air left his lungs. He stared, unable to comprehend the level of violence, the sheer, calculated cruelty it had taken to do such a thing to a child. The doctor, the preacher. He felt a cold, murderous rage fill him, so pure and so cold it made his vision swim. He saw Henderson sneer, "Spoiled good." He looked up from the ruin of her body to her face. She was watching him, her eyes wide with terror, waiting for the verdict, waiting for the disgust. He did not show her the rage. He reached out and, very gently, pulled her dress back down, covering her. He stood up. He walked to the corner and picked up the thick blanket she had been using by the fire. He brought it back to the bed and wrapped it around her, pulling her small, shaking body against his chest. He held her. He sat on the bed, rocking her as he would a terrified animal, or a grieving child. He said nothing. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his other arm a band of iron around her, protecting her from the ghosts in the room. She cried until she was empty. She sagged against him, exhausted. "I'm not," she whispered, her voice broken. "I'm not a woman anymore. I'm nothing." Eli held her tighter. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He looked out the window, at the cold, clean, moonlight on snow world. "You're wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You're more woman than anyone's had the right to break." He held her until the last tremor left her body, until her weeping quieted into the exhausted, ragged breathing of a child after a nightmare. He held her until the moon passed the window and the fire burned down to glowing embers. He did not let go. When her weight finally sagged against him in true, deep sleep, he gently laid her down and covered her with every blanket they owned. He sat in the chair, the one he had slept in for weeks, and watched her. He did not sleep. The rage he had felt, that cold, killing rage, had settled into something hard and heavy in his gut. He watched her pale face, serene in sleep, and he understood that he was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man guarding. The morning broke a new, terrible silence. The storm had not abated. The wind still shrieked, a constant reminder of their isolation. But the silence inside the cabin was worse. It was thick with shame. Liddy woke first. She saw him in the chair, his head slumped, his big hands resting on his knees. He looked worn down, older. She slipped from the bed, her movements small, guilty. She could not look at him. She could not bear to see the pity, or worse, the disgust in his eyes. He had seen her. He had seen the proof, the preacher's words. Henderson's sneer, they were all true. She was damaged, spoiled. She busied herself with the fire, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the kindling. Eli woke the moment she moved. He watched her. He saw the hunch of her shoulders, the way she kept her back to him. He saw her shame, and it felt like a hot poker in his own chest. He was ashamed, too. Ashamed that he had been the one to push, to ask, to cause her to relive that pain. ashamed that he had seen a thing no man should ever see, the mark of another man's brutal sin. He stood, his joints cracking. "Coffee's low," he said, his voice a rough gravel. I'll be careful with it," she whispered, not turning. They did not speak for 3 days. The storm raged. The snow piled in great, sculpted drifts against the cabin, burying the windows on the north side, plunging the room into a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, the pop of the fire, and the howl of the wind. They moved around each other like ghosts in a tiny, shared grave. Eli went out twice a day to check the animals in the barn, fighting his way through waist-deep snow. The rope he had tied from the door to the barn his only guide. He came back caked in ice, his beard a frozen mass. He would nod. She would nod. She cooked, she mended, she scrubbed the floor. She worked with a desperate, quiet frenzy, trying to make herself useful, trying to earn the air she breathed. Eli watched her. He saw her hands, red and raw from the lye soap. He saw her trying to erase herself, to become nothing but a pair of working hands. The sight of it made his teeth ache. On the 4th day of silence, he went to the barn and did not come back for hours. Liddy watched the light fade, a knot of panic tightening in her stomach. The wind was worse. The snow was a white, blinding chaos. She pictured him lost, fallen, frozen, just yards from the door. When the door finally burst open on a gust of wind and ice, he stumbled in, half frozen, carrying a mess of scrap wood, old planks from a broken crate, a few pieces of warped pine he had been saving to patch the roof. He dropped them by the fire, saying nothing. He spent the next 2 days working in the corner of the cabin, the one she had claimed as her own. He worked with a quiet intensity. The only sounds were the rasp of a small handsaw and the scrape of his knife as he smoothed the edges. He used wooden pegs, tapping them in with a mallet. Liddy did not ask. She did not approach. She stayed by the fire, stitching his torn shirt, pretending not to watch. On the 3rd morning after he brought the wood in, he woke before her as always. He took his tools and the last of the scraps and placed his creation in her corner, where her bedroll had been. It was a desk. It was not large, and it was not fine. It was made of mismatched wood, the top scarred from its previous life, but it was level. It was sturdy. And the top, the part where a person would rest their arms, had been sanded smooth as river stone. Beside it, he had placed a small, 3-legged stool he had made from a stump. When Liddy woke and saw it, she stopped. She stared. She walked over to it, her hand hovering over the smooth wood. A desk, a place to sit, a place to be. She looked at Eli. He was at the fire, his back to her, poking the flames. He acted as if nothing had happened. She touched the wood. She ran her fingers along the edge he had so carefully rounded. She thought of the preacher's punishments, the doctor's cold hands, the sneer of the shopkeeper. She thought of the burned stew and the hard bread, and she looked at this desk, built by the large, scarred hands of a man who had seen the worst of her and had not turned her out. It was the first gift anyone had ever made for her. It was the first time in her life she had been given something that was not a requirement, not a payment, and not a violation. She sat on the stool, put her hands on the desk, and bowed her head. She did not make a sound, but hot, silent tears began to fall, spotting the pale, sanded wood. They were not tears of shame. They were not tears of pain. She did not know what they were. Later that day, she dug into her worn carpet bag. From the very bottom, beneath her only other dress, she pulled out a small, leather-bound book with a broken clasp and a stub of a pencil. She sat at her desk. For the first time, she had a place that was hers. Her back was to the room, to him. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her mother's recipes, written in a looping, optimistic hand. The last half of the book was empty. Liddy put the pencil to the page. At first, she wrote only words: cold, wind, fear, stone. Then the words began to string themselves together. She wrote about the preacher, his face a mask of righteousness. She wrote about the doctor's office, the smell of carbolic acid and the lie of the word barren. As the days wore on, she wrote about the small cabin. She wrote about the sound of the axe in the snow, a steady heartbeat in the white silence. She wrote about the shocking stain of blood from a slaughtered chicken, and the way the wind made the chimney moan. She wrote poems, short, breathless things, about the cold, and she wrote about the warmth of Eli's hands, how they could be rough enough to split oak, gentle enough to check a goat's hoof, and warm enough to hold her while she broke. She wrote, and for the first time since her mother died, she felt a part of herself, the part that lived inside her head, begin to breathe again. Eli did not read her words. He never looked over her shoulder. He just gave her the time, and the space, and the silence to fill the pages. The tension in the cabin remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp edge of shame. It was a low, vibrating hum of awareness. They were trapped, just the two of them, and the world had been reduced to this single room. They were acutely, painfully aware of each other. The brush of his arm as he passed her, the sound of her breathing as she wrote, the way she tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was tired. One night, the last of the lamp oil was gone. The storm, which had quieted for a day, had returned with a new, vicious fury. They sat in the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, the fire casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. The candle, set on the table between them, sputtered. The flame dipped, flared, and then, with a small hiss, went out. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, deep darkness, save for the red glow of the embers. "The matches," Eli said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "I have them." Liddy said they were by her elbow. In the same moment, they both reached for the small tin box. His large, rough hand covered hers. It was a jolt, sharp and warm. Neither of them moved. His fingers were calloused. Her skin was soft. They were frozen. His hand completely engulfing hers. In the darkness, she could feel the pulse in his wrist. He could feel the fine, small bones of her hand. She did not pull away. He did not pull away. He turned his hand, his thumb brushing her palm. She gasped, a small, tiny sound. He leaned in, guided by the sound. She leaned in, guided by his touch. Their faces were close. He could smell the soap on her skin. She could feel the warmth of his breath. "Liddy," he whispered. Their lips brushed. It was not a kiss. It was an accident. A bare, glancing touch of skin, softer than a moth's wing. They both recoiled, pulling back as if struck. Eli cleared his throat, his hand fumbling for the matchbox, snatching it from her. He struck a match. The sudden flare of sulfur and light was blinding. He lit the candle. He did not look at her. She was staring at her hands, her face crimson. The air in the cabin was so thick it was hard to breathe. The moment lingered, unspoken, pulsing in the small space between them. The storm worsened. The world outside was an Arctic hell. The snow was a prison. One morning, the sound of the wind was pierced by something else, a high, terrible screaming from the barn. Eli was on his feet, grabbing the rifle from the pegs by the door. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Bolt the door behind me." He was gone, disappearing into the white swirl. Liddy ran to the door, her heart hammering. She bolted it, as he said, but she could not stand the silence. The not knowing. The goat's screams had been cut short. She pressed her face to the icy glass of the window, rubbing a small patch clear. She could see nothing but the swirling snow. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, his dark shape emerged from the white, walking slow. His head down, he was dragging something. She unbolted the door. He kicked the snow from his boots and entered. He was not dragging the goat. He was dragging the body of a wolf. It was huge, gray, and gaunt. Its jaws were dark with blood. "It got the nanny," he said. He was breathing hard, tore her throat out. You killed it." "It was starving. Got in through a loose board in the back." He leaned the rifle against the wall. "The storm's driving them down from the high rocks." He looked exhausted, and a deep sadness pulled at his features. He had lost another mouth to feed, another source of milk. "I have to bury her," he said, rubbing his face. "Can't leave her. It'll just bring the rest of the pack." "I'll help," Liddy said. "It's not work for you." "I'm not made of glass," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. She pulled on his heavy coat, the one he had given her on the ride to town. He looked at her, surprised, but nodded. They fought their way to the barn. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. Inside, the scene was grim. The small goat was dead in the snow that had drifted through the broken board, her blood a shocking stain. It took them 2 hours. The ground was frozen solid. Eli used a pickaxe. The thud and clang of it against the iron-hard earth, the only sound besides the wind. Liddy held the lantern, her arm aching, her fingers numb. She helped him drag the small body to the shallow grave. They worked together, a grim, silent team. When they were done, they were both rimmed with frost, their breath pluming in the air. They walked back to the cabin, side by side, united by the small, brutal death. That night, the cold, the exhaustion, and the weeks of terror finally caught up with Liddy. She began to shiver. By midnight, she was burning with fever. She became lost. She was not in the cabin. She was back in her stepfather's house. She thrashed in the bed, her eyes wide and unseeing. Eli sat by her, helpless. He forced water between her cracked lips. He bathed her face with a rag dipped in melted snow. He held her hand, trying to anchor her. But she was gone, trapped in the past. "No," she mumbled, twisting her head on the pillow. "Please, I cleaned the floor. I did. I was good." Eli's gut twisted. He smoothed her hair back from her hot forehead. "It's all right, Liddy. You're safe. It's just me. It's Eli." But she could not hear him. Her terror grew. She began to push at his hands, her small fists surprisingly strong. "Get off! Don't! Preacher!" she cried out, her voice sharp. Eli froze, his hand dropping from her face. You said you wouldn't," she sobbed, her body arching in the bed. "It hurts. It's not right. Don't open me again, please, God, no, don't open me." The words, "open me again," hit Eli like a physical blow. He staggered back, his stomach heaving. He had assumed, he had imagined. But this was worse. This was a horror beyond his comprehension. Not just assault, mutilation. He looked at the small, fevered woman in his bed, and he finally understood. This was not a man who had simply abused his stepdaughter. This was a monster who had tried to destroy her. And he realized, with a chilling certainty, that a man like that would not simply let his property go. The preacher, he knew, would come for her. The next day, Elfiddy's fever broke. She woke, weak and pale, to find Eli sitting by the bed. He looked as if he had not slept in a year. He said nothing of her dream. He just fed her broth, his hand gentle. But while she slept, he had taken his shotgun from the wall. He had oiled it meticulously. He had checked every shell. And then he had slid it under the bed. Not on the wall, not in the corner, under the bed, where he slept, where his hand could find it in the dark. The fever, though terrible, had broken something else. It had broken the last wall of their politeness. Yiddy, in her delirium, had screamed her worst secrets into the room, and Eli had stayed. A week later, she was stronger. The storm had finally, truly broken. A weak, watery sun shone, making the endless expanse of snow glitter. They were in the bed. The nights were still bitterly cold, and the habit of him sleeping on the hearth had been abandoned after the fever. He still kept to his side, she to hers. But she turned to him in the dark. "Eli, I'm awake. I'm afraid." "The preacher?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her hair brushing the pillow. "He'll find me. I know he will. He told me I could never escape him." "He'll have to come through me," Eli said. It was a simple statement of fact. She was quiet. Then she moved, a small, hesitant motion across the mattress. She touched his arm. "I'm tired of being afraid." He turned to face her. In the faint moonlight, he could just see her outline. "I want to," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What we tried. I want to, but I don't know how." Her voice broke. "I don't know how to not be broken." Eli's heart ached. He thought of her fevered words. He thought of the shotgun beneath him. He moved his hand, covering hers. "Then we won't rush," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "We'll learn." He pulled her closer. He did not try to kiss her. He did not try to lift her nightgown. He just pulled her against his side, so her head was resting in the hollow of his shoulder. He kept his arm around her. What are you doing?" she whispered, her body stiff. "Learning," he said. "Just sleep. You're safe." And so they began. They spent the nights wrapped together, fully clothed, over the blankets. At first, she was rigid, a straight line of fear against his body. He just held her. He did not move. He just breathed. Slowly, deeply. After a few nights, she relaxed. She let her head rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart under her ear. It was the most calming sound she had ever known. She matched her breathing to his, in, out. Their trust deepened in the darkness. He would tell her stories about the land, about tracking elk in the high country. She would tell him about her mother, about the songs she used to sing. One night, curled against him, the moonlight striping the floor, she felt a warmth she had never known. It was not desire. It was peace. She felt brave, Eli. He murmured, half asleep. "Do you—" She hesitated, the words feeling sharp in her throat. "After what you saw, do you still want me, even broken?" He was quiet for a long moment. She thought he had fallen asleep. She tensed, regretting the question, feeling the familiar sting of shame. Then his arm tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. His voice rumbled against her hair. "Liddy," he said, his voice thick. "You're the only thing that ever made me want again." The snow did not vanish. It surrendered. It wept. For weeks, the world was the sound of dripping. Water ran in rivulets from the eaves of the cabin, trickled down the faces of the gray cliffs, and turned the hard-packed yard into a thick, grasping mud. The world, frozen solid for 5 months, unlocked itself. With the thaw came work. The silence of the blizzard was replaced by the sounds of labor. The barn roof, where the wolf had broken through, had to be rebuilt. Eli spent his days on a ladder. His hammer blows a steady echo against the hills. The small pen for the goats needed mending. The fences, buried under 10-foot drifts, were a tangled wreck of wire and snapped posts. Liddy, who had lived for months in the twilight of the cabin, now lived in the sharp, bright sun. The cold air felt new, clean. She was no longer just stitching leather. She was hauling water, clearing rocks, and helping Eli stretch the new wire. The work was brutal. It left her hands cracked and her muscles screaming. But it was good. It was the ache of living, not of surviving. Near the cabin door, in a patch of earth that caught the morning sun, she began to dig. The ground was still cold, but soft. She used a small hand spade, turning the soil. Eli watched her from the roof. She was planting the small handful of seeds, carrots, beans, hardy greens that he had bought in town before the storm. She was making a garden. She was putting down roots. They worked side by side, a quiet, efficient team. The heavy, charged air that had followed the fever had dissipated, replaced by an easy companionship. They ate together, slept in the same bed, and still, he did not touch her. The line, once drawn by fear and shame, was now held in place by a deep, unspoken respect. He had made her a promise that they would learn, and he would not rush it. He would wait for her. The town was a necessity they had both avoided, but the thaw meant the roads were passable, and their supplies, flour, salt, cartridges, were dangerously low. Eli prepared the wagon. "I'll stay," Liddy said, her voice quiet. She was scrubbing the floor, her back to him. Eli paused, holding the harness. "You don't have to. Henderson won't say a word. I promise you that." "It's not him," she said. "The cabin. It feels safe. I'm not ready for town." He nodded. He understood. He hitched the team and left, telling her he would be back by nightfall. Liddy spent the day alone. For the first time, the solitude was not a threat. It was a comfort. She baked bread. It was still heavy, but it was not burned. She fed the animals. She sat at the small desk he had built for her and wrote in her book. She wrote about the smell of the mud and the way the sun felt on her arms. She was watching the pass when his wagon rattled into view. Just as the sun turned the cliffs a deep, bloody red, she felt a lightness in her chest she could not name. It was the relief of his return. He was quiet as he unhitched the team. It was not the easy quiet of the morning. It was the hard, cold silence she remembered from the first weeks. He carried the sacks of flour and salt into the cabin, stacking them in the corner. She waited, her stomach tightening. When all the supplies were inside, he stood by the door, his hat in his hands. He did not look at her. "What is it?" she asked. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter. It was crumpled, the paper cheap and gray. "This was at the post, from Pastor Allen. It's addressed to him, but it's about you." Liddy's blood went cold. She knew the handwriting on the envelope. It was sharp, angry, slanted to the right, her stepfather's. She did not take the letter from him. She could not touch it. What does it say?" Eli unfolded it. His voice was flat. "He writes that his beloved stepdaughter, Liddy Grace, was taken in by a melancholy of the mind, that she wandered away in a fit of confusion. He asks Pastor Allen to inquire, to see if anyone has seen a frail girl, wandering alone. He says he is sick with worry. He says he wants his daughter returned home, so that he might care for her soul." Liddy backed away until she hit the wall, her hand covering her mouth. "He's looking," she whispered. Her voice choked. "He's looking for me." "He's lying," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "It doesn't matter," she cried, the old, familiar panic rising, cold and sharp. "He's a preacher. They'll believe him. They'll send men. Eli, they'll find me." She ran to her corner, to the small carpet bag she had arrived with. She began throwing her few things into it, her book, her other dress. "What are you doing?" "I have to go. I have to leave. Before he comes. I won't be here when he comes. I won't let him find me." "Stop. He'll ruin you," she sobbed, turning to face him, her eyes wild with terror. "Don't you see? They'll say you stole me. They'll say you're keeping me here against my will. He will destroy you just for being kind to me." "Liddy!" He crossed the room in 2 strides. He took the bag from her hands and threw it on the floor. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip hard, anchoring her. "Stop. I have to run." "No." His voice was iron. "You're done running." "You don't understand." "I understand," he said, his face close to hers, his eyes dark with an anger she had never seen. "This is not his house. This is not his town. This is my land, and you are my wife." He shook her, just once, a small, hard rattle. "This is your home now." She stared at him, her panic stalled by the sheer force of his will. "He'll kill you," she whispered, the tears streaming down her face. "Let him try," Eli said. The words hung in the air, a vow. He had not just defied her fear, he had claimed it. He had taken her terror and stood in front of it. He did not let her go. His hands slid from her shoulders to her arms, his thumbs stroking her skin. The argument, the terror, had left the air vibrating between them, raw and alive. She was shaking, but not from fear anymore. She looked at him. His face was hard, the lines etched deep from the wind and his anger. But his eyes were only for her. He had seen the worst of her, the broken, ugly, secret parts. And he had not run. He was standing. He was staying. She lifted a trembling hand. She did not touch his face. She laid it flat on his chest, over the solid, steady beat of his heart. She could feel the small, hard circle of the ring under his shirt. "Eli," she whispered. It was not a plea. It was an answer. He did not kiss her. He bent, sliding one arm under her legs and the other behind her back, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. She made a small sound, her arms flying around his neck, clinging to him. He carried her to the bed. He laid her down gently. The sun was gone, and the cabin was in that deep blue twilight that comes before true dark. He stood over her, his large frame a shadow. He was giving her a last chance to say no. She held his gaze. She did not weep. She did not look away. Slowly, she lifted her hands and began to unbutton the collar of her plain wool dress. He knelt by the bed. His hands, which had been so hard on her shoulders, were now impossibly gentle. He helped her with the buttons. He pushed the rough fabric off her shoulders. He did not rush. He undressed her as if he were unwrapping a fragile, priceless thing. When she was bare, she did not hide herself. She lay in the twilight, her small body pale, the silver map of her old scars and the deeper, puckered ruin from the preacher visible in the gloom. Eli looked at her. He felt the rage rise again, the cold sickness, but he pushed it down. He bent his head. He did not kiss her mouth. He kissed the scar on her shoulder, where the birch rod had once broken the skin. He kissed the faint line on her ribs. And then, his lips barely brushing her skin, he kissed the tight, terrible scar tissue on her inner thigh. Liddy gasped, her whole body arching, a sob catching in her throat. It was a touch not of lust, but of absolution. He was unmaking the preacher's work. "It will hurt," she whispered, her voice raw. She was not afraid. She was just stating a fact. "I know," he said, his voice thick. He covered her with his own body, his weight a comfort, not a threat. "I'll be gentle as I can." He moved slowly. He kept his promise. He was careful, but she was right. The scar tissue, healed tight and wrong, did not yield. She cried out, a sharp, piercing sound of pure physical pain. Eli froze, his body rigid. "Liddy, I'm sorry. I'll stop." "No," she gasped, her fingers digging into his back. Please don't stop." It was a command. It was her choice. He looked down at her face, screwed up in pain, her eyes clenched shut, and he did as she asked. When it was over, he held her, his heart hammering against her ribs. He could feel her trembling, or perhaps he was the one shaking. He held her in the dark. Silent cabin, his mind blank, his body overwhelmed. He felt a dampness on her legs. He pulled away, his stomach twisting. "I hurt you," he breathed. "God, Liddy, I hurt you." He reached for the matches, fumbling, his hand shaking. He struck one. The small, sulphurous light flared. He looked. There was blood. Not much, but it was bright red against her pale skin. He looked at her face, expecting to see the old terror. She was crying, but her eyes were open, and she was smiling. A small, watery, broken smile. She reached up, her hand touching his rough cheek. "This time," she whispered, her voice cracking with the tears. "This time, I wanted it." The match burned his fingers, and he dropped it. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her. In the dark, he put his head in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. He made no sound. He had not cried when Sarah died. He had not cried when he buried his son. He wept now, silent, racking sobs. Not for the pain, but for the relief. He had not broken her. She had been whole all along. Peace settled on the cabin for 10 days. It was a new world. They touched. When he came in from the fields, she would meet him at the door and he would kiss her. A simple, solid press of lips. When they sat at the table, their knees brushed, they slept wrapped around each other. His body a warm, solid wall at her back. Then the rider came. He was not from the town. He was a stranger, thin and hard-eyed, wearing 2 guns. He rode a horse lathered with sweat. He stopped at the edge of Liddy's small, hopeful garden. Eli, who had been splitting wood, stepped in front of the cabin door. Liddy was just behind him, her hands twisting in her apron. "Looking for Eli Monroe," the stranger said, his eyes scanning the ranch. "You found him." The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled paper. He tossed it onto the mud at Eli's feet. "That's a bounty notice, posted in Cheyenne." Eli did not bend to pick it up. "I don't deal with bounty men." "You might," the man sneered. "This one's for a fugitive. Name of Liddy. Last name's listed as Croft." Eli's blood ran cold. "Croft. Wife went missing from her husband down in Nebraska," the man continued, enjoying this. "Husband's a preacher, man of God. Silas Croft. Demands her immediate return, offering $50. That's a lot for a woman." Liddy made a small, strangled sound. Eli put an arm back, keeping her behind him. Eli finally understood. The letter to Pastor Allen had been the first step. This was the second. The preacher hadn't just claimed her. He had forged a marriage. In the eyes of the law, Liddy was not his runaway stepdaughter. She was his fugitive wife, and Eli was harboring her. "Never heard of her," Eli said, his voice flat. The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. He looked past Eli, at the pale woman hiding in the doorway. He grinned. "Looks like I just found her. $50 is $50. "Get off my land," Eli said. His hand was not on his gun, but he stood near the axe. "Now, friend," the man said. "I don't want no trouble. Just hand the woman over. The law's on my side." "There's the law," Eli said, nodding at the distant mountains. "And there's what's right. You've got till I count to 3 to ride out. 1. The man's grin faded. He looked at Eli's face. He saw no fear. He saw no compromise. He saw a man who had already made his decision. 2. The bounty hunter spat into the mud. "This ain't over, rancher. $50 will bring more than just me." He yanked his horse's head around and galloped away. The moment he was gone, Liddy collapsed onto the porch steps. "He married me," she whispered, her voice hollow. While I was, he made me sign papers. He said they were for my keep, for the doctor. Oh God, Eli, he owns me." "No one owns you," Eli said, his voice a cold fury. "But he does," she cried, grabbing his arm. "Eli, listen to me. In the law, he does. That man was right. You'll be hanged. They'll hang you for keeping another man's wife. You have to let me go. I'll go back. I'll tell them you didn't know." "No," he said. "Please," she begged, her face white with a new, selfless terror. "I lived through him once. I can do it again, but I can't. I can't be the reason you die." He looked down at her. at the woman who was willing to walk back into hell for him. He pulled her to her feet. "You are Liddy Monroe, my wife. This is your home. That is the only law I know." That night, he saw her packing, her movements furtive in the dark. She was going to run, to save him. He said nothing. He walked to her worn carpet bag. He plunged his hand into it and pulled out the small leather book. Tucked inside was a folded, official-looking document, the marriage lines, signed by her stepfather, and a witness she had never seen. "Eli, no," she said, reaching for it. He walked to the fireplace. "It's a lie." "It's proof." "It's a chain," he said. He tossed the paper into the low-burning embers. They watched it together. The paper blackened at the edges, the preacher's elegant signature curling into ash. Liddy let out a breath she felt she had been holding her entire life. "Now," Eli said, turning from the fire, "we prepare." The next day, they transformed the cabin. It was no longer a home. It was a fortress. Eli boarded the windows, leaving small, narrow slats to shoot through. He barred the door. He brought the water barrels inside. He laid his guns on the table. The rifle, the shotgun. Liddy looked at them. "Teach me." Eli hesitated. "Liddy." "He is coming," she said, her voice flat, cold. "You can't be awake forever. I will not be the woman who hides. I will be the woman who fights." He nodded. He took her outside. He set a can on a fence post 50 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy. She could barely lift it. "It'll kick," he said. "Don't fight it. Squeeze. Don't pull." She raised it. Her arms shook. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the kick slamming the rifle butt into her shoulder, knocking her back a step. She cried out. The can was untouched. "Again," he said. She wept in frustration. "I can't." "Yes, you can." He stood behind her. He put his hands over hers, steadying her. "Open your eyes. Look at what you're afraid of. Now, breathe out. Squeeze." Their fingers tightened together. The gun fired. The can spun into the air. She stared. He let go of her. Again. She loaded it herself. She raised it. Her arms still shook. But she held it. She breathed. She squeezed. She missed. Again. She fired until her shoulder was a purple, swelling bruise. She fired until the smell of gunpowder was in her hair. She fired until she hit the can 4 times out of 5. A week later, a rider appeared on the high ridge. Just one. He sat on his horse, watching the cabin. A scout. "Get inside," Eli said, grabbing his rifle. "No." Liddy came out onto the porch, the heavy shotgun in her hands. She stood beside him. The man on the ridge raised his own rifle, taking aim. Eli's shot was faster. The crack of his rifle echoed, a flat, hard sound. The man on the ridge screamed, grabbing his arm, his rifle clattering onto the rocks. He was wounded, not dead. Eli stood on the porch. He did not fire again. He let the man scramble onto his horse. "Go back!" Eli's voice roared across the valley, strong and clear. "You tell him, the woman you're looking for is gone. This is my wife, Liddy Monroe. This is my land. You come back and you'll be buried on it." The man fled, disappearing over the ridge. Eli and Liddy stood on the porch, the smoke from his rifle hanging in the air. The first battle was over. That afternoon, Liddy was quiet. She took the large washing kettle and went down to the creek, where the first wildflowers were blooming. She picked them by the armful, blue lupine, purple aster. She boiled them in the kettle, the water turning a deep, rich indigo. Eli watched her. She went into the cabin and came out with a thin, gray dress she had been married in, the one she had arrived in. She submerged it in the dye. She stirred it with a wooden stick. She pulled it out and hung it on the line. It was no longer the color of ash and fear. It was the color of the wildflowers, the color of the Wyoming sky. That night, she put it on. The dress, once hanging on her gaunt frame, now fit the woman she had become. Her shoulders were stronger. Her arms were steady. She turned to Eli, who was standing by the door, watching her, his heart in his throat. The pale, haunted girl was gone. In her place was a woman. "I'm ready," Liddy said. "I'm ready to stay." The next morning, the sun was a weak, pale yellow, but it was the first time Liddy had seen it without fear. She put on the blue dress, the color of wildflowers. It felt like armor. Eli said nothing as he hitched the wagon. He did not ask if she was sure. He knew she was. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand on her arm, and for the first time, she did not feel like his ward, but his partner. He climbed up beside her, his rifle resting in its scabbard by his knee, his revolver heavy on his hip. They rode to town together. They did not speak. They moved through the high plains morning, the air still sharp with the memory of winter, the land around them raw and muddy from the thaw. Liddy sat straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She was not the girl who had arrived on the stagecoach, huddled and hollow. She was a woman who had learned to shoot, a woman who had chosen to stay. When they reached the settlement, the street was quiet, but curtains twitched. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, was sweeping his porch. He saw them, and his eyes widened. He saw Liddy, in her bright dress, meeting his gaze. He looked away, his sweeping becoming suddenly, nervously energetic. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. It was a small, clapboard building, barely larger than a shed, with a single barred window and a sign that hung crookedly. Eli stepped down, the mud sucking at his boots. He turned and held his hands up for Liddy. She took them, and he lifted her down. They did not knock. Eli pushed the door open. The office was cramped and smelled of stale coffee, tobacco smoke, and wet wool. Sheriff Brody was a man past 50, with a heavy gray mustache and tired, watery eyes. He was sitting at his desk, a stack of paperwork in front of him. He looked up, surprised. As they entered, "Monroe," he said, his voice a low gravel. He nodded, his gaze flicking to Liddy and then away, as if her presence was improper. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Eli said. He did not remove his hat. He reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled, mud-stained bounty notice the scout had dropped. He flattened it on the sheriff's desk. "This was delivered to my ranch by a man claiming to represent the law." Sheriff Brody squinted at the paper. He recognized it. He reached for a similar, cleaner notice tacked to the wall behind him, one that had arrived on the stage. "Aye, it's official. Came in from Cheyenne last week. A bounty for a runaway wife, Liddy Croft." "Her name," Eli said, his voice flat and cold, "is Liddy Monroe. She is my wife. We were married by Pastor Allen the day she arrived." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He stroked his mustache, his eyes troubled. He looked at Eli. "Monroe, I don't want trouble, but this is a legal claim. From her husband, a preacher, Silas Croft." "He is not her husband," Eli said. "This paper says he is, and I've heard of the man." The sheriff's gaze drifted to a small, worn Bible on the corner of his desk. "I was a deacon back in Ohio. He passed through, spoke at a revival. He's a powerful man of God, a voice of thunder." "He is a liar," Liddy said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the smoky air. The sheriff looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the blue dress, the bruised shoulder still visible where the neckline dipped. He saw the way she stood, not behind Eli, but beside him. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his tone softening, but still firm. "You're overwrought. This is a matter between your husband and, well, Mr. Monroe, a woman in your state. In my state? Liddy asked. You mean damaged? Barren? Is that what you heard? Is that what he wrote? The sheriff flushed. It ain't decent to speak of such things. It wasn't decent to do them, Liddy said, her voice rising, gaining strength. He is my stepfather, sheriff, not my husband. He punished me. After my mother died, he told the town I was sinful. He took me to a doctor who lied, and then he used that lie to send me away, to sign me over to Mr. Monroe. Now, Mrs. Monroe, the sheriff said, standing up. He looked uncomfortable, trapped. That's a terrible accusation to lay at a man of God. Your stepfather. He forged that marriage paper, Eli interrupted, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, to claim her as property, because she ran. I have no proof of that, Brody said, his frustration growing. I have this. He slapped the official notice. This is the law, and I am bound to uphold it. That bounty hunter, or others, will be back, and if they come, I'll have to honor their claim. By now, the sound of raised voices had drawn attention. Mr. Henderson had abandoned his sweeping. Pastor Allen's wife, drawn by some unseen signal of moral conflict, was standing on the boardwalk, her arms crossed. A few other townsfolk, men from the saloon, women from their homes, had gathered. The doorway of the sheriff's office was crowded. Sheriff, Liddy said, her voice loud enough for those outside to hear. You want proof? You want to know what kind of man of God he is? Liddy, Eli said, his voice a low warning. He did not want to see her do this to herself, to lay herself bare for these gossips. She put a hand on his arm. They have to know what they're honoring. She turned and stepped out of the office, onto the boardwalk. The small crowd fell silent. They stared at her. The damaged woman, the mail-order bride who had caused Eli Monroe to turn violent. My name is Liddy Grace Monroe, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Before that, I was Liddy Grace. My mother died 4 years ago. My stepfather, the preacher Silas Croft, told me I was a vessel of sin. Indecent, the pastor's wife hissed from the edge of the crowd. Yes, it is, Liddy said, her eyes finding the woman. It is indecent. It was indecent when he used a birch rod on me for spilling flour. It was indecent when he used his belt because I looked out the window. And it was indecent when he started coming to my room, in the dark, telling me he had to root out the sin with his hands. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The men looked at their boots. Mr. Henderson looked pale. He told me, Liddy continued, her voice breaking, the tears now streaming down her face, that I was unclean. He took me to a doctor, a friend of his, and that doctor hurt me. He hurt me. And then he told the preacher I was barren, damaged. She looked at the women in the crowd. And then my stepfather used that. He said I was worthless. He said no man would have me. He said I was spoiled. He said he had to open me, to cleanse me. She was sobbing now, but she did not stop. He hurt me. He tore me. The scars he left, they are the proof. He is not a man of God. He is a monster. And when I ran, when Mr. Monroe offered me a safe place, he lied. He forged that paper because he does not want a daughter. He does not want a wife. He wants a thing he can break. She finished, gasping for breath. The silence of the street absolute, terrifying. Some of the women in the crowd turned away, their faces pale, pulling their children close. They could not bear to hear it. But others wept. One woman, a rancher's wife, was crying silently, her hand over her mouth. Then a voice, strong and rough, cut through the silence. She's telling the truth. An older woman, Agnes, the town's midwife, pushed through the crowd. She was a hard woman, with skin like dried leather and eyes that had seen every birth and death in the valley for 20 years. She walked right up to Liddy and put a rough hand on her shoulder. She turned to the crowd and to the sheriff, who was standing in the doorway, his face ashen. "I have not seen this girl's body," Agnes said, her voice ringing. "But I have seen the work of men like him. I have seen girls and wives who came to me, bleeding, saying they fell on a fence post. I have seen the righteous hand of a husband who believes his wife is his property to break. That preacher," she said, jabbing a finger toward the bounty notice. "That man delivered no word of God. He delivered only hell." She looked at Sheriff Brody. "And you, Ben Brody, you know it. You've seen it too. Now you choose. You stand with that piece of paper? Or you stand with her?" The sheriff stood frozen for a long, heavy moment. The entire town was watching him. He looked at Liddy, at her tear-stained, defiant face. He looked at Eli, whose hand had not left his gun, whose eyes promised war. He looked at the midwife and at the weeping women in the crowd. He let out a long breath. He turned, walked back into his office, and took the official bounty notice from the wall. He picked up the crumpled one from his desk. He walked to the pot-belly stove in the corner, opened the iron door, and tossed them both into the flames. He watched them curl, blacken, and turn to ash. He turned back to Eli and Liddy. "As far as this territory is concerned," he said, his voice final, "Liddy Croft is gone. There is no bounty. There is only Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." He looked at Liddy. "Go home, ma'am. You're safe here." The ride back to the ranch was a long, quiet exhale. The sun felt warmer. The mud seemed less a burden, more a promise of new life. When they reached the cabin, Eli lifted Liddy from the wagon. He did not let her go. He held her, his face buried in her hair, and she clung to him, her body still trembling with the aftershock of her confession. They stood for a long time by the wagon, just holding on. That night, the peace in the cabin was deep and profound. They sat by the fire, Liddy at her small desk, Eli in his chair, cleaning his rifle. The air was comfortable. Eli stopped his work. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Then, he reached under his shirt. He pulled the leather thong over his head. Liddy turned, watching him. He held it in his palm, the plain gold band. Sarah's ring glowed in the firelight. He looked at it, his face filled with a complex, quiet grief and a sense of release. He had held on to it for 2 years, a symbol of his failure, of the life he had lost. He looked at Liddy. She had not replaced that life. She had started a new one. He held the thong out to her. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice rough. "Sarah, I couldn't let it go. I've worn it since she died." Liddy looked at the ring, then at his face. She understood. She did not reach for it. "Eli, I want you to have it," he said. It's not for you to be her. It's for you to be you. You're my wife, Liddy. You're the one who is here. You're the one who stayed." Her eyes filled with tears. Slowly, she took the thong from his hand. She held the small, warm ring. It was the last piece of his grief, and he had given it to her. The next day, she did not put it on. She fired up the small forge Eli used for mending tools. It was hot, difficult work. She used a small crucible. She melted the ring, watching the gold and Sarah's memory dissolve into a bright, liquid light. She poured it carefully into a small mold she had carved into a piece of soapstone. It cooled into a small, imperfect disc, a medallion. It was rough, not polished, but it was solid. She took Eli's sharpest knife, and, with patient, careful hands, she carved their initials into the soft gold, an E and an L. She did not carve them side by side. She intertwined them, the L curling around the straight, strong back of the E. She found the leather thong and looped it through the hole she had made. Then she put it around her own neck. It rested against her skin. Warm. A new symbol, born from the ashes of the old. Spring turned to summer. The valley lost its raw, muddy look and exploded into a sea of green grass and wildflowers. The work was endless, but it was good work. They rebuilt the long stretch of fence on the west pasture. They worked as a team. He would set the posts, his muscles straining. She would follow, stretching the wire, her hands, once soft and chapped, now strong and calloused. One afternoon, she was kneeling in the dirt, securing a wire to the base of a post, her blue dress stained with mud, her face streaked with sweat. She looked up at him, her hair falling from its pins, and she smiled. Her face was sun-warmed, her hands were dirty, and she had never been more beautiful. He leaned down and kissed her, his lips tasting of salt and sun. The cabin was a home. Her garden was thriving. The small green shoots of beans and carrots a testament to her faith. The nights were warm, their lovemaking no longer a question of pain and fear, but a slow, unfolding discovery of pleasure. They were healing each other. The peace lasted 6 weeks. It was broken by a rider, a young boy from the town, who rode his horse to a lather and arrived at their ranch in a cloud of dust. "Mr. Monroe!" he yelled, sliding from the saddle. "Sheriff Brody sent me. He's here. The preacher. He's in town." Eli and Liddy froze, the hammer Eli was holding still in his hand. "He's got 2 men with him," the boy panted. "The sheriff told him to leave, told him the bounty was void. But the preacher, he's wild, sir. He's screaming about righteousness. He says he's coming to get his property. Sheriff's gathering a posse, but he said the preacher rode out this way." "Go back to town," Eli said, his voice calm, deadly. "Tell Brody we'll handle it." He tossed the boy a coin. The boy, wide-eyed, scrambled onto his horse and fled. Liddy's face was white, but she did not run. She did not cry. She turned and walked into the cabin. When she came out, she was holding the shotgun. Eli grabbed his rifle. They did not retreat to the cabin. They walked, side by side, to the edge of their property, to the new fence Liddy had helped build. They stood and waited. They did not wait long. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, dark shapes against the bright summer sky. They rode down, not fast, but with a terrible, righteous certainty. The man in the middle was Silas Croft. He was tall, dressed in a preacher's black, his face long and pale, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. He was exactly as Liddy had described him, a monster wearing the mask of God. He reined in his horse 10 yards from the fence. His 2 men, hard-looking and armed, flanked him. "Liddy," the preacher said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. It was the voice that had charmed deacons and terrified a child. "You have shamed me. You have shamed God. You will come with me now." "She's not going anywhere," Eli said. He held his rifle at his side, not aiming, but ready. The preacher's gaze slid to Eli. "You, the sinner, the man who harbors another's wife, you will release her, or you will face the fires of hell." "This is her home," Eli said. "This is a den of sin," the preacher roared. "She is my wife, bound by law." Liddy stepped forward, the shotgun held steady in her hands. Her arms did not shake. She looked at the man who had haunted her every night, the man who had broken her body and tried to break her soul. "You broke me," she said, her voice clear, carrying on the summer wind. "But he made me whole." The preacher's face twisted. The mask of righteousness fell away, revealing the raw, possessive fury beneath. He saw her. He saw the blue dress, the solid strength in her stance, the medallion at her throat. He saw the man beside her. He saw that she was truly, finally, lost to him. "Whore!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You'll burn for this!" His hand dove inside his black coat, reaching for the gun he had hidden there. He was fast, but Eli was faster. Eli's rifle was at his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. He fired. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the cliffs. It was not a warning shot. It was not aimed to kill. It was aimed to stop. The preacher screamed, a high, thin sound, as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. He landed hard in the dirt, his black coat covered in dust and his own blood. His two hired men froze, their hands hovering over their guns. They looked at the bleeding preacher on the ground. They looked at Eli, his rifle already leveled, his face a mask of cold iron. And they looked at Liddy, who had not flinched, her shotgun now aimed directly at them. They raised their hands, slowly. The sound of hoofbeats thundered down the trail. Sheriff Brody and 4 other men from town, armed and ready, pulled up behind them. "We saw him draw, Monroe," the sheriff said, his gun aimed at the 2 hired men. It was a clean shot, self-defense. 2 deputies dismounted and hauled the preacher to his feet. He was clutching his shoulder, sobbing, not in pain, but in pure, impotent rage. "She's mine," he shrieked, his voice broken. "She's mine!" "She's no one's but her own," the sheriff said in disgust. He looked at the blood. "And you're under arrest for attempted murder." They hauled him away, a broken, bleeding man, his lies finally silenced. The 2 hired men went with them, their hands bound. Eli and Liddy stood at the fence, the smoke from Eli's rifle hanging in the still summer air. The sound of the horses faded, leaving the valley in a deep, profound silence. Eli lowered his rifle. Liddy let out a breath she had been holding for a lifetime. She was shaking, a delayed reaction to the terror. Eli put his arm around her. He pulled her against his side, and she rested her head on his shoulder, her shotgun heavy in her hands. They stood there, together, on their land, and watched the dust settle. The dust settled. The sound of the posse's horses faded, taking with them the preacher's last, desperate curses. The valley, which had held its breath, exhaled. A small wind, smelling of summer grass and pine, moved down from the cliffs. Eli did not move. He stood with his arm around Liddy, the rifle heavy in his other hand. Liddy was pressed against his side, her body trembling with the final release of a lifetime of fear. The shotgun was a dead weight in her arms. She let it slip, her fingers numb, and it thudded softly onto the porch. She did not cry. She just breathed. She breathed in the smell of the gunpowder, the sun on the dry dirt, and the warm, solid scent of her husband. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of home. That summer, the land healed. The winter, which had been a brutal, gray tyrant, gave way to a season of startling life. The wildflowers Liddy had used for her dress now seemed to cover every flat surface. The slopes were a sea of blue lupine and purple aster. The creek banks were choked with the yellow sweet clover. The world, which Liddy had only ever seen as a place of sharp edges and cold gray rock, softened. The jagged cliffs themselves seemed to pull back, their threat diminished by the sheer, stubborn greenness of the valley. The work of the ranch was a balm. They were outside from sunup to sundown. Eli mended the last of the fences. His hammer blows a steady, comforting rhythm. Liddy's garden, once a desperate patch of hope, exploded. The soil, fed by the melted snow, was rich and black. She coaxed beans to climb, carrots to root, and hardy lettuce to spread. She spent hours on her knees in the dirt, her hands stained, her face freckled by the sun. She learned the land, and in turn, the land claimed her. The fear did not vanish overnight. For a month, she would still jolt awake if a coyote howled too close to the cabin. Eli, too, would find his hand reaching for the shotgun under the bed in the dead of night, his ears straining against the silence, listening for hoofbeats. But the preacher did not return. The bounty hunters did not come. The land kept its peace. One morning, almost 2 months after the showdown, Liddy woke to a familiar, yet long-forgotten pain, a low, dull cramping in her belly. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. She slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Eli. She went outside, clutching her stomach. She thought of the preacher's violence, of the doctor's grim pronouncement. She was terrified that the damage inside her, the deep, unseen ruin, was finally breaking her. She spent the morning in a quiet, cold terror, waiting for the pain to worsen, waiting to die. But the pain did not worsen, it changed, and with it, something else. She was by the creek, washing the breakfast tinware, when she saw it, the proof, not of a wound, but of a cycle. Her monthly bleed, absent for so long, for more than a year, had returned. She sat on the creek bank, the tin plate slipping from her numb fingers. She stared at the water, at the small, bright red proof that her body, locked in fear and starvation for so long, had finally unlocked itself. It was not a sign of death. It was the deepest, most profound sign of life. Her body was working. It was healing. She wept. She wept for the girl who had been told she was barren. She wept for the years of terror that had frozen her, inside and out. She wept from sheer, staggering relief. She told Eli that night. She was hesitant, ashamed, the old lessons of her body being unclean still buried deep. She waited until he was mending a bridle by the fire, her hands twisted in her apron.
"Eli," she whispered, my time, it came."
He stopped his work. He looked at her, confused for a moment. He saw the tears in her eyes, the flush on her cheeks. He saw her shame. He set the bridle down. He stood, walked to her, and took her hands. They were trembling. His were steady. He just held them, saying nothing, his thumbs rubbing small, warm circles on her palms. He did not act disgusted. He did not turn away. He looked at her, his gaze soft in the firelight. "That's good," he said, his voice low. "That's good. Liddy, it means you're well." That night, she could not sleep. She lay beside him, listening to his deep, steady breathing. She felt the medallion, the melted ring, warm against her skin. She was mended, but she did not feel whole. She felt pieced together.
"Eli?"
she whispered in the dark. "I'm here. I'm still broken. I know I am. The scars, they're still there. I'll always be the girl the preacher hurt." He was quiet for a long time. He turned, pulling her close against his chest. He held her, his arm a solid, warm weight.
"Liddy,"
he said, his voice a low rumble against her hair.
"Look at this cabin. The roof leaked. The door was weak. Look at the fence. The winter broke it.
Look at my hands." He took her hand and pressed her palm against the jagged scar on his own. "This world, it breaks everything. It's supposed to." He kissed the top of her head. "We weren't made to be whole. We were made to hold each other's pieces." Their life found its shape. The story Liddy had told on the sheriff's boardwalk had rippled through the valley, changing things in ways she never expected. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, rode out. He stopped his wagon, his hat in his hands, his face red. He would not look at Liddy. He looked at Eli. "Monroe," he said, clearing his throat. I'm offering you a standing line of credit. Whatever you need. Flour, beans, seed. For your wife. No charge for the next 6 months." Eli, who had stood ready to turn the man away, was silent. He saw the apology in the man's posture. He nodded. Once. "We thank you, Mr. Henderson." A week later, Pastor Allen's wife left a basket of eggs and a fresh-baked loaf of bread on the porch. There was no note. The biggest change came not from the town, but from the wilderness. Agnes, the midwife, arrived one day. She was not alone. In the back of her wagon sat a young woman, barely 16, with a swollen, split lip and a darkness in her eyes that Liddy recognized instantly. "Her name is Mary," Agnes said, her voice blunt. "Her father's a drunk over in the next county. He's like yours. Liddy, she ran. She's got nowhere to go. I figured you'd understand." Liddy looked at the girl, who was trembling, clutching a small bundle. Liddy saw herself, the haunted, terrified ghost who had stepped off the stagecoach. She looked at Eli. He was watching her, not the girl. He was leaving the choice to her. Liddy walked to the wagon. She held out her hand. "My name is Liddy," she said. "You're safe here." The girl, Mary, did not speak, but she took her hand. That night, Liddy led Mary to the small desk Eli had built. She gave her the book of empty pages and the pencil. "You don't have to talk about it," Liddy whispered, her hand on the girl's shoulder. "But you can write it down. You can give it to the paper. It helps." Mary was the first. A few months later, a second woman came. This one was older, fleeing a brutal husband who gambled at the saloon. She had heard of the Monroe Ranch, the place where a woman would be believed. The cabin became a refuge. Eli, with Liddy's help, built a second, smaller cabin near the barn, a place for the women. He taught them to mend fences. Liddy taught them to read, to write their names, to tend the garden. She taught them to shoot the shotgun. The townsfolk, who had once whispered, now helped Mr. Davies, a rancher from the south end of the valley whose wife had been in the crowd that day, rode up. He was leading a beautiful, leggy Palomino foal. "Mr. Monroe," he said, touching his hat. "My wife, she said to thank Mrs. Monroe for her courage. We wanted to offer this as a thank you from our family for making this valley a decent place." Eli, his throat thick, could only nod. He took the rope, the foal, a sign of new life, of a new reputation, nuzzled Liddy's hand. The ranch was no longer a place of isolation. It was a community. It was a home. Summer bled into a cool, sharp autumn. The harvest from the garden was bountiful. Liddy and the other women spent weeks canning, drying, and salting, their laughter echoing in the small cabin. One morning, Eli and Liddy rose before the others, a habit they kept, a way of finding the quiet they had built together. They stood on the porch, a shared cup of coffee steaming between them. The sun was just beginning to touch the cliffs, turning them a soft, rosy pink. Liddy leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Her hand rested, unconsciously, over her own belly. "Eli," she said, her voice soft. "I'm here." I don't care if we never have children." She looked up at him, her eyes clear, filled with a deep, settled love. That doctor, that preacher." "They told me I was barren, and I believed them. I thought I was worthless. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's true." She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over the medallion. "You gave me life. That is enough. This is enough." He said nothing. He just pulled her closer, his kiss on her hair a silent vow. But months later, as autumn began to sharpen into the first hint of winter, the life she had found began to change. She was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion she could not shake. She felt dizzy in the mornings. She chalked it up to the hard work of the harvest. Then, one afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, the world went black. She crumpled to the ground. Eli found her. The panic he felt was a cold, sharp blade, more terrifying than the preacher's gun. He carried her inside, his face ashen. He thought she was dying. He thought the old wounds, the internal damage, had finally broken. He rode like a madman, galloping the 10 miles to town in less than an hour. His horse lathered. He did not go to the town doctor. He burst into the midwife's small house. "Agnes," he gasped. "It's Liddy. She collapsed. She's pale. Please." Agnes did not ask questions. She grabbed her bag and was on her horse in a minute. When they arrived, Liddy was awake, sitting up in bed, looking pale and confused. The other women fussed around her. "Out!" Agnes commanded, shooing them all from the cabin. "Eli, you two, go, boil water. I don't know why, but it's what you men do. Just go." Eli paced the porch, his hands clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. He was a boy again, helpless, listening to Sarah's life ebb away in a snowstorm. He could not lose her. He would not. An hour passed. It felt like a lifetime. The cabin door opened. Agnes stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was stern. Eli's heart stopped. She's... Agnes looked at him, and her leathery face broke into a smile so wide it startled him. "You're a fool. Eli Monroe, a blessed fool." "What? Is she sick?" "Oh, she's sick. All right," Agnes cackled. "She's got a sickness that'll last about 7 more months, if I'm any judge." Eli stared. What did you say?" "That preacher," Agnes said, shaking her head. "And that godless doctor he used. They're the ones who are barren of truth. That girl in there, she was just locked up, frozen with fear. She was never barren, not for a minute." Eli stumbled past her, his legs weak. Liddy was sitting up. When she saw his face, she burst into tears. "Agnes said," Liddy whispered, her hand on her belly. "She said, it's true. We're..." He crossed the room and fell to his knees by the bed, burying his face in her lap. He could not speak. He just held her, his body shaking. That night, they sat on the porch, wrapped in a single heavy blanket, under a spray of stars so bright they looked like chips of ice. The ranch was quiet. The other women were asleep in their cabin. It was just the two of them, and the cold, clean air, and the new, impossible truth. Liddy was weeping, but it was not the weeping of fear or pain. It was the last, great flood, the final cleansing of the preacher's poison. He took my life," she whispered, her voice thick, her tears falling onto his hand. "He told me I was nothing, a ruined thing, an empty, spoiled good. I believed him. For so long, I believed him." Eli pulled her tight. He looked up at the vast, silent Wyoming sky. He felt her, small and strong, tucked against him. He felt the new, tiny life she held, a life they had made not from perfection, but from 2 broken halves. He kissed her, his lips cold, his heart full. "You're safe now," he whispered, his hand resting over hers on her belly. "All of you." The winter came, but it was not a threat. It was a comfort. The snow fell softly, blanketing the valley, tucking the ranch in for the cold months. The cabins were warm, the lanterns glowing like small, brave suns in the blue twilight. From the smaller cabin, the sound of laughter, of women talking and reading, drifted on the air. On the porch of the main house, Eli stood, his arm around his wife. Liddy was bundled in his heavy sheepskin coat, her own belly a swollen, proud curve under the wool. The medallion she had made rested against her heart. They stood in the cold, watching the lights of their home, a place built not of wood and nails, but of mended pieces and earned joy. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had fought for their peace, and they had won. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment and tell us. For more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West, and please share your thoughts on Eli and Liddy's journey in English.